Hi everybody, it's Judy here. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and thank you so much for watching today's video. Today's video is going to be winter care tips for houseplants. I'm gonna go through about 15 care tips in this video that'll hopefully help you keep your plant collection, your plant babies alive, or at least holding on throughout the winter. It goes without saying, winter is very, very dark, very cold, and everything needs just that little bit of extra TLC. And so in today's video, I'm gonna be covering about 15, 14, something like that, care tips that I personally practice throughout the winter to help keep my plant family happy. So if your plants are kind of struggling in these colder months, I'm hoping that this video will be helpful. Fungus gnat. Will be helpful and insightful to equip you with a bit more knowledge into the extra care that houseplants need through the colder months. So let's go. Tip number 1. My first tip is to avoid repotting plants. Through the colder months, plants will tend to slow down their growth, which means their roots aren't going to actually become root bound within these colder months. Even if your plant is already root bound and you notice this actually through the winter, the plant's probably not going to do a whole lot more growing even if you do repot it. So I would put off repotting until the growing season, spring or summer. For a plant having to deal with the cold, for example, and less light available to it, you add on top of that for a plant having to push out its roots and go into almost the shock of being repotted, it'll actually probably stunt the growth of your plant when it does come to the growing season, because its roots have been disturbed through the colder months and it just doesn't quite know what to do with itself. I'm sure there's a scientific explanation for this, but for me, I just kind of think of it in the way of how maybe, for example, I would feel if I had to get undressed and then dress myself outside. It's kind of that cold, shocking feeling. I would never do that, by the way. It's just for an example. A mental picture of what would happen, for example, to your plant's roots if you did repot them during the winter months. The next one is quite a big one actually, and it's to move your plants closer to its light source. This could mean moving your plants closer to a window or even installing grow lights. I don't personally have a grow light. I actually took my studio lights out of my filming room for my other YouTube channel, and I've got it currently set up here in my dining room, and it's set up on a side of my plant shelf where there is no window. My window is here and my studio light is here. It's really not a grow light. It wasn't created to be that, but it's still light and it's better than no light at all. You could set up lamps in the darker corners of your house where your plants are. If you're in a position to be able to leave your lights on all day, you could do that too, or you could invest in some grow lights, and I'm gonna leave some linked in the description box down below, which I personally haven't used but I've found really good reviews on, so you could go check those out if you were interested. Obviously, the sun exposure during the winter time isn't as strong as it would normally be during the spring and summer, and so I have to move my plants closer to the window so that they can soak up as much of that light as they possibly can. Poor things, this last week, it's been raining and cloudy, and I can really tell the luster in their leaves have kind of lacked because of the lesser amount of light that they have been exposed to in the last several months. So what I personally have done is I've moved my light-loving plants closer to the window and kind of reshuffled my plant shelf as well to ensure that the more light-needing plants are closer to the higher shelf, and the more low-light tolerant plants, I've put them down on the bottom shelf. So it's more really of just a reshuffle of your plants, thinking of their light needs, also thinking of the level of light that is available to you throughout the day during these more cloudy and dark months. Your plants will thank you, they'll be a lot more happier, and it'll give them a fighting chance to make it through to the next growing season. The next tip kind of almost sort of contradicts that last tip that I just said, where it's move your plants closer to the window, but this is kind of goes hand in hand, and you just need to find the happy balance between the two. So this next tip is to remove your plants from cold drafts, like away from a window. So it does kind of contradict the first one, so I'm going to explain it this way. So I've moved my plants closer to the window, but I've also made sure that they aren't sitting in a spot where maybe the door or the window opens, where that's where a cold draft can come through. I also make sure that the foliage isn't actually touching the cold window pane, because the cold window pane often will get frost, will get a fair amount of condensation on the windows, and that can also introduce mold or mildew on the leaves of the plants. So I have them in a happy spot where they're closer to the light, but not so close to the window that they're touching the cold window pane and receiving all the cold drafts that reverberate from the window, from the glass window itself. On the same spectrum, moving plants away from cold drafts is you want to move your plants also away from your heat vents. I don't know what kind of heating that you have in your house, but when we have our heating on, it makes the air really dry. This will decrease the humidity within your home, and as you know, plants love humidity, and so you're going to want to move them away from the heat vents or from the direct line where your heater might be blowing its warm air. Plants do love the warmth, but they probably won't respond really well if they're in the direct line of where the dry heat is coming from. And that probably gives me a really good segue into the next tip, where we need to introduce humidity into the air. It really depends where you live, but generally throughout the winter we will have our heaters running, which will inevitably dry out the air. So we will need to introduce more humidity into the air for our plants. And for ourselves as well. I have really dry skin, so having the humidifiers running for both my plants and for me, it's beneficial to everybody in my home. I have my heater running at a constant 22 degrees and I just have it on low, and just having that as a constant warmth through the home, both for myself and for my plants. The plants still do need warmth. So while there is that warm air coming through and it is kind of drying out the air, I still have my humidifiers running at a constant 75%. They run throughout the day. When it reaches that level, they switch off and then they turn on again when the humidity in the air has lowered it back down. This also goes hand in hand with my next tip, which is airflow. With the heater running, which is dry air, the humidifier helps combat that dry air. So there is warmth, there is humidity, but you also need to make sure with the humidifiers running, you'll also need airflow through your home. Because if you have humidity but no airflow, it can actually introduce both mold, mildew, and actually weaken the structure of your home, depending on what kind of home you live in. But as a general rule, you're not going to want to introduce a whole heap of humidity within your home, because it can actually rot. It can rot things, and we don't want that in our home at all. Airflow is also very helpful to our plants, because just as the same as humidity can damage our home, they can also damage the foliage. It can introduce mold, mildew, fungus growths, bacterial growths on the foliage. So with this humidity, we still need airflow, just as we have airflow outside. If we mimic the environment of outdoors where plants naturally come from, they will be happy within our home if we kind of recreate that natural environment. How you could have this airflow is you could if you had ceiling fans, leave your ceiling fans on a medium or low throughout the day. You could set up pedestal fans throughout your home so it's still circulating the air. You could have certain doors open depending on the layout of your house. You could have certain doors staying open so that the air can flow through your home. I personally have both my ceiling fans in my bedroom on 24/7, just on low, because I do have a humidifier running in my bedroom, and just to have that humidity running through, I still do need the airflow to keep the leaves of my plants kind of like moving in the air, and it also distributes the humidity throughout the room as well. This is something that I do all year round, but throughout the winter especially, the air can be quite still and stagnant, so it's really important, so while we have that heater running, to have the airflow coming through our home and through the foliage of our leaves as well. The next tip is to clean your windows. This might seem like something that's really boring and something that maybe you're really good at. Maybe you keep on top of cleaning your windows as well, but the reason why I say cleaning windows is that because there is already less light coming through our home from the outside where the sun is constantly covered over by clouds, if we clean our windows, just take that extra film of dust and dirt off the windows, then the light can come through even better and touch and caress the foliage of our leaves. Just like we clean our plant leaves off of dust and dirt, the same goes for our windows. The light can come through better, our plant leaves can breathe and photosynthesize a lot better and absorb that light. So just keeping your leaves clean as well as your windows clean just helps that light come through a lot better and more efficiently, and gives our plants even more of the extra help that they need in being able to absorb what light we are given throughout the darker and colder winter months. Something that I also like to do throughout the colder months, and which I kind of do all year round anyway, but it is especially important throughout the winter, is to group your plants together. This will help them retain the humidity and also the warmth around their leaves. It's almost like giving them a sweater, but they are the sweater. They kind of hug each other, they embrace each other, and they just keep each other warm, give each other the humidity, and it's kind of like the helping hand that they need to make it through the winter. The biggest reason why I actually group my plants is to help them retain their humidity. I do have humidifiers running, but they can't be running in every single spot of the house all the time. Depending on the plant, you may need higher humidity than grouping them together will provide, so you can maybe get even smaller humidifiers and put it in the center of your grouping of plants, and it'll introduce the humidity that they actually need, especially if you have your heater running, which dries out the air. I'm going to link some smaller humidifiers. I have a larger Bauer humidifier, which I will also link, but Bauer does have some smaller humidifiers, which are great, and I've heard great reviews of, so I'm going to leave them linked down below if you wanted to check them out. Something that I also do throughout the winter is that I adjust my watering. A watering schedule isn't really a thing for me because watering will vary depending on the light, depending on the warmth, depending on how fast the plant is growing or the volume of soil within a pot. So a schedule isn't really something that I have when it comes to watering. But as a general rule, I would water less in the winter months. But throughout the winter, if you have your heater running all the time, like I do in my house, it's set at a constant 22 degrees. Sometimes I end up actually watering some of my plants more, especially if they're in like direct line of my heater or in the same room as my heater. And some other plants may need less watering because, as you know, the house is not as warm, and so the soil will dry out a lot slower as well. So it's just a matter of adjusting the level of water you give your plants according to the changing conditions within your home. If you're not really sure about whether or not your soil is actually dry, then I would really recommend investing in a moisture meter. It comes in so handy and really takes the guesswork out of knowing whether or not I need to actually water my plant. I'm also going to link one of those moisture meters in the description box down below just to make things a little bit easier for you guys. Also, here's another tip. When it comes to watering, I personally use tepid or room temperature water. It is actually possible to shock your plants if you blast them with cold water, like straight out of the tap. Imagine yourself jumping into the shower with just the cold tap turned on. Does that feel good? It doesn't, does it? I hate cold showers. Now, I'm not recommending that you give your plant a steaming hot shower, but what I mean to say is you need to make sure that you're giving your plants tepid, like warm, or not warm, but like not super cold, or room temperature water. Using room acclimated water, or at least not fully cold water straight from the tap, will actually keep your plants from going into shock. And once a plant is in shock, it might actually just push it straight into full dormancy when the roots are introduced to a sudden cold bath. Once your plant is in full dormancy, you can't even hope anymore for any more growth until the weather warms up. The next tip is plant rotation. So plant rotation actually gives plants an even distribution of light. Plant rotation is important all year round. It doesn't matter if it's winter or not. But actually rotating your plant every few weeks gives it an even distribution of light because it's already struggling to receive the light, because it's already lower, it's already colder, and there's just less sunlight in general. A mission of rotating your plant will mean that one side of your plant will look balder and actually suffer because one side is getting all the light. It can also cause stunted growth and make your plant look lopsided because all the light is there. I personally rotate my plants, or some of my plants, every few weeks when I notice that it's all leaning to the light source. I mean, you might not personally mind if your plant is all like one-sided, but your plant will actually really appreciate you if you rotate it. Small rotations at a time is actually better than a full 180 rotation because the leaves still need to absorb the light. So for example, if you did a complete 180 rotation, all the leaves will be pressed up against the wall and they won't be able to receive the light as efficiently as they would if you just rotated it a little bit every few weeks. The next tip is to regularly inspect your plants. Throughout the winter, it's easy to neglect your plants, just as I tend to neglect myself, which is directly a result of just not doing as well mentally through the colder months, which means I don't have as much motivation or mental capacity to actually care for my plants. So if you're like me, then here's your reminder to inspect your plants regularly. So pests tend to flock to plants that are sitting stagnant in a dry environment. When those pests come out, they're gonna make themselves at home, and it can only take like a couple weeks in a lapse of plant care or plant attention before these pests stake a foothold in your collection, especially if you have your plants grouped together with their leaves touching. So you're gonna wanna inspect your plants every few days at least and make it a regular thing. I personally try and inspect my plant leaves every day or at least every other day, whether it's I do one section one day and then another section another day and just kind of rotate through my plants. And it doesn't mean you have to like take a magnifying glass and just have a proper close look at them. Sometimes plants will tell you if you look at the leaves and you see a few little spots, just have a closer look at those leaves. Plants will generally start to communicate with you whether or not they have contracted pests. Although having said that, I always say that it's so much easier to get rid of pests in the early stages before they actually decimate your plant and take a foothold within the foliage. So yeah, it's just really important to inspect your plant leaves regularly and just taking control over pests taking over your collection. Cleaning your plant leaves, this is the next tip. That also kind of goes hand in hand with your regular plant care and regular plant inspection. So this is what I do. This kind of goes hand in hand with plant inspection and pest prevention or pest management, is that whenever I water my plants, I actually put them in the shower. And I've got a whole video about this and I'm gonna leave it linked up here if you guys wanna see that. But cleaning the plant leaves, I put them in the shower. This ensures a much more thorough washing down of the leaves, washing off and just like brushing away any pests that might be on the leaves. And having clean leaves also means that they will absorb the light better. If you do, however, need to clean your plant leaves, but the soil is still moist, you don't want to put them in the shower because that will probably overwater your plants and you don't want to do that either. So if your soil is still moist and it's drying down a lot slower due to the colder weather, but your plant leaves are still in desperate need of a clean, then you could use a spray of eco oil or neem oil and wipe the leaves down with a soft damp cloth. This helps prevent pests and also removes dust, which prevents an efficient absorbing of light. Cleaning your plant leaves also gives you an opportunity just to be up close and personal with your plants and just keep an eye on them. I say prevention is so much easier than cure, which I think is why I've been quite successful with my plant collection so far. Don't get me wrong, I still get pests. It's literally just a reality of plant parenting, but being regular with my plant care and plant management means that I have happier plants. Go figure. Another tip is to consider investing in some grow lights or heat mats where necessary. I'm actually considering purchasing some heat mats and I will leave those linked in the description box down below. I haven't actually bought them yet, but I'm considering buying these particular ones, especially for my propagation box and some of my like lower plant shelves that don't get as much light or warmth or airflow. Sometimes plants just need higher light and higher warmth than you are able to naturally provide them throughout the winter. So installing these artificial add-ons will actually make such a huge difference to the life and growth and overall health of your plants throughout the winter. The next tip is actually understanding that sometimes plants do just go dormant throughout the winter. And that's okay, it's normal, it's natural. It's the natural cycle of life. it can be very alarming when they just suddenly start declining very, very quickly for no apparent reason. But some plants do just need this cycle of dormancy in order to be able to thrive in the growing season. So they just need a rest. It's literally just part of their nature, and it just all comes down to knowing the nature of your plant and not being so anxious and alarmed about it when your plant actually does stop growing or drops off some of its leaves for no apparent reason. So a really good example of plant in this is actually the alocasia. They will droop and lose their leaves, not knowing that this is a natural cycle of the alocasia, especially during the winter months. This could actually lead to over caring for your plant, like trying to fertilize it or overwater it because you just don't know what's happening with it, and could actually lead to just killing off the plant completely instead of giving them the chance to rest, and they will just naturally bounce back in the spring. So it all comes down to knowing your plants. Maybe do a bit of research, a bit of Googling, you know, or like me, you can learn from experience. I have killed maybe a few plants from over caring for them because I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know that wintertime was worse for plants. I just didn't know. So all of this knowledge has come from Google and watching YouTube videos and a lot of experience as well. And the last tip I have is probably something that I don't follow very well because I literally just made a video about it. But this is to avoid taking trimmings or taking propagation. The first reason being, propagations don't generally do well anyway, or take off as fast or root out as fast as they would normally during the growing season. Especially if you have them in a glass of water on the windowsill, they're not going to do very much because it's cold. Even if you put them in a propagation box like I have with my last batch of cuttings that I've taken, they're not really taking off very much because it's cold. This is why I want to get a heat mat for this propagation box to introduce the warmth that they actually need to be able to root out. So they've got the humidity and they've got the light, but they just need that warmth. Also, the second reason to not take cuttings or propagation from your plants is that it can actually send your plant into further shock if they're having to cope with both the cold and losing some of their limbs. Because you've taken off these extra leaves, the rest of the plant isn't able to absorb enough light to keep the rest of it alive because it's got less leaves. And depending on the size of your plant, there is a possibility of just sending it into full shock, stunting its growth. And in some cases, depending on the size of your plant, it might kill off your plant completely if you're just taking too many cuttings off it too frequently. So just be wary. I mean, it's not a complete no-no to do during the winter, but it's definitely just some things to think about before taking cuttings because it might not be the best thing to do for your plant's health during the winter. And the last tip I have is to not fertilize your plants. Now, this is the general rule, and I know I have said in my videos before that I personally still do fertilize some of my plants throughout the winter. As a general rule, as a general overarching umbrella over all plants, they will kind of slow down throughout the winter. They're not needing that fertilizer, just give them a little bit of a rest. Fertilizing them, if they're not pushing out new growth, will run the risk of burning the roots, burning the foliage of the plant, and it just overall putting it in some really bad health. And here is where I might be a little controversial. Some of my plants, as long as they're still pushing out new growth, they're still in good conditions because I've given them warmth, I've given them light, I've given them airflow, I've given them humidity. Some of them might still be okay and still keep pushing out new growth. In this case, I will fertilize them, but with a really watered down solution. And this isn't a general rule by any means. This isn't a universal rule for anyone's plants because I don't want to be responsible for killing anyone's plants. But for me personally, if my plants are still pushing out new growth, even if it's very, very slowly, if they still have that new growth coming through, then they are still using the nutrients within the soil. So I will still fertilize them, but it's not a general rule. So use your discretion with this. Just be smart about how you fertilize or don't fertilize your plants throughout the winter. This is just a little bit of extra information and extra knowledge that I'm giving to you from my own experience so you can make your own informed decision when it comes to fertilizing fertilizing your plants throughout the winter. So yeah, those are all the tips that I'm going to be sharing in today's video. I hope they were helpful and informational to you, able to give you a little bit of extra knowledge and equip you with the proper plant practices to keep your plants happy and healthy and thriving throughout the winter. I'm guilty of not being able to do all of these or provide all of these ideal situations for plants myself, but again, it's a growing journey for both my plants and myself, and I hope this video was helpful for you in that aspect. Any products that I mentioned that I use or am thinking of purchasing, I'm going to leave them linked in the description box down below so you can go check them out if you're interested. If you have any winter care tips that I didn't cover in this video, I would love it if you left them in the comments down below so that everyone else can learn from your experience. Let's share the knowledge around, guys. I'm sure all us plant people appreciate the help and advice that we give to each other kindly without judgment. I appreciate all of you guys because majority of you are so very kind in your comments. I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.